like Hannah Arendt's dichotomy of power and violence. Like, if you use violence, you don't have power. If you have real power, you don't need. I mean, Al-Qaeda resorted to spectacular terrorism because they have no power. They have no mass appeal, and the best way to compensate for that, to get attention, was that they engage in, and they still do engage in terrorism. But there is no evidence that, in fact, the United States was able to stem out whatever traces of Al-Qaeda existed and may have triggered the rise of Al-Qaeda in places where Al-Qaeda did not exist before. I think it should also be said that the United States, by its language on the war of terrorism, insisted on attributing any resistance to foreign occupation in Lebanon, or in Palestine, or in Iraq, or in Afghanistan, to Al-Qaeda motivation, or Al-Qaeda membership. Just like Israel wants to attribute all resistance to its own occupation to religious fundamentalist anti-Semitism. And of course, if you go back to when fundamentalists did not in any way have a role in the Palestinian resistance movement in the 1960s and 70s, we find that they used to attribute Palestinian resistance to Israel to some diabolical Soviet plot. So they always try to marry their own hostility to the Palestinian will to resist with that of the United States foreign policy. Now, the fourth point is that despite promises of a Palestinian state, there was no actual progress on construction of a Palestinian state at all. If anything, the United States Bush administration reinforced the division and fragmentation of what is left of Palestine outside of Israel itself, and to basically impose pro-Israeli militias to rule in the name of the Palestinians, with very little token respect or justification about democracy and legitimacy. I mean, here is the so-called Palestinian president treated as the head of state, even though his term expired in last January, and yet we are told he's not going to run for re-election. I mean, re-election, he's not a president anymore. And in fact, in many Arab TV stations, like New TV in Lebanon, he is referred to officially as that president whose term has expired last January. I mean, which is a far more accurate description than the Palestinian Authority president, which we read in the American press. Fifthly, I think the United States promised that Islam is not the enemy, and yet it did sponsor the Sunni Shiite war. I mean, we don't know much about that now yet, but I think there was a report by the International Crisis Group, which you can find on their website, which talked about American policy in Iraq. And clearly the United States was intended from its very beginning to play on the Sunni Shiite split. And then the Saudis came in to help, given the Wahhabi doctrine, hostility against all Shiites, in order to take away Arab public hostility to Israel to make Iran the new enemy, despite what public opinion surveys say about that. And I think that the Bush doctrine also included an affinity with Christian anti-Islamism. And the record of the United States, of the Bush administration, was quite clear about that. The role of, I mean, this is why it will be so mistaken to only talk about American foreign policy under the Bush administration by references to the neoconservative. It seems to me that evangelical Christian had an absolutely important role. If you look at America's foreign policy in the Sudan, if you look at America's foreign policy in Lebanon, let us not forget that American evangelical group were instrumental as far back as the 1980s in funding the propaganda services of the surrogate militia of thugs that was armed, financed, and created by Israel in the region where I was born, South Lebanon, called the South Lebanon Army. And the idea of splitting Arabs into various groups in order to divide and rule, as the cliche goes, is not absolutely novel. There is in the first volume of Cohen's book, Army of Shadows, which was translated from Hebrew by University of California Press. The first volume talks about 1920. There was a trip by Chaim Weizmann, who goes to Palestine, and he assembles the head of the Zionist leaders and the intelligence services that were active at the time, as early as 1920. And he asked them to devise a plan to bolster the Zionist stand in the Middle East. And they came up with a draft document about what to do. And one of the items, I think number 6, listed in that book was, and I'm translating, the instigation of a Christian-Muslim divide among the Palestinians. So this is not novel. I mean, that's exactly what the document talked about. And I have to say that the Palestinians, I mean, when you look back at the literature, if you look at the private papers of Akram Zuaiter, you can see flyers, statements, speeches. You can go and look at Yehoshua Barak's book about the history of the Palestinian national movement. You'll find the Palestinians were impressively keen and aware of the objectives and goals of the Zionist movement from the very beginning. So, in response to that, the early form of Palestinian political organization, before the rise of Palestinian political parties of the 1930s, Al-Istiqlal and the Nashashibi Party and the Hajj Amin Party, you have what is called the Muslim Christian Association. And look at the name. The name was intended to undermine Zionist effort at dividing the Palestinians into Christians and Muslims. And of course, the anti-Islam bigots in the United States, Irshad Manji, Ibn al-Warraq, were utilized by the White House, and they came to the White House in order to serve the agenda of the United States. 6th, there was unconditional support not only for Israel, but for Israeli wars, all of them. The war on Lebanon, the war on Gaza continued into the last days of the Bush administration, and of course the various bombing and killing campaign of Zionism. And of course, in Zionist history, the killing of Palestinians is a systematic pattern that began from the birth of Zionism all the way on to today. And this is what Hannah Arendt noted back in 1951 when she said that she did not understand how Zionists operate on the assumption that the only language Arabs understand is the language of force, which is exactly the advice that Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami gave to Bush in private meeting in the White House. She said, if anything, I am looking back at the first 50 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict. She said in 1951, the only language Arabs do not understand is the language of force, particularly the Palestinians. I'm adding the last statement, by the way, particularly the Palestinians. 7, Iraq as a model, that was also an utter failure. The model, in fact, I mean, for obvious reasons, there were no eager takers. There were no Arabs who said, we want what they have in Iraq. We want car bombs. We want to be shot at checkpoints manned or womaned by the American soldiers. We want Abu Ghraib. We want air raids on our apartment buildings in civilian neighborhoods. We want a foreign occupation. A foreign occupation that is so brazen, that is so impudent, that it refers to Arabs who come to Iraq to fight the Americans as foreign fighters, thereby implying the American soldiers who are in Iraq are not foreign. I mean, they suddenly blended in. They are part of, I don't know, I mean, heavily armed tourists who have a whole supply of weapons in their service. Now, when it comes to Obama, I find that the reception to Obama was very positive in the Middle East, even though I wrote about the Obama doctrine before even Obama took office, trying to dispel the early misconception that Arabs had about him. So why were there positive reaction to Obama in the Arab world? Several. One, because he was African American, which seems to be, I mean, why should there be a reception to, I mean, it's a reference to his dark skin. I mean, I would say there is no reason for that. First, because we should not stereotype all African Americans. I mean, it seems to me the Arabs still are suffering from under the generalization about blacks that were taken from their acquaintance with one famous African American, Muhammad Ali, and his speeches and statements about Muslims and Arabs. So they assume that every black in America is like him. And that's why they are always surprised when they see a Secretary of State like Colin Powell making speeches that are pro-Israel. And they're like, you know, he does not sound like Muhammad Ali. So there's a bit of racism to the positive reception to Obama in the Arab world. Now, if you are responding to Obama as black because you think that the African American community is going to be more sensitive to the suffering of the Palestinians, it's also inaccurate. I mean, why should victims of one form of injustice be immune from practicing another form of injustice? I mean, I think all of us are guilty of that. I mean, you can be a victim of racism who engages in misogyny in your private life and sexism or domestic violence. You know what I'm saying? So I don't think, plus